to you, the taxpayer. But that's only $18 trillion, right? We've only got 18 trillion bucks in debt. No worries. Our country produces $18 trillion in GDP. $18 trillion in debt. We're only at 100% debt to GDP ratio. There are lots of countries that are far worse than that. Japan's at 200%. We're really not in all that bad a shape, Jason.
Well, unless you count unfunded liabilities.
Well, let's get into that. So we're talking a little bit about debt. The funny thing is that the crazy thing is all of this seems really bad, and it is. But all of this back and forth, all of this negotiation and the drama that we talked about and that we read about, it's all an illusion. This is a sideshow. I'm going to direct you guys, and I will post a link to this report at jasonstapleton.com under today's episode. So the date of the episode or the title of the episode always matches up with the title of the post at the Jason Stapleton program. So you can go back and find it. This is testimony to the Senate Budget Committee by Boston University Professor of Economics Lawrence J. Akotikoff. I'm going to read for you a little bit about what he said. Again, this testimony to the Senate Budget Committee. Our country is broke. It's not broke in 75 years or in 50 years or in 25 years or in 10 years. It's broke today. Indeed, it may be in the worst physical shape than any developed country, including Greece. The Declaration and this declaration of national insolvency will no doubt shock you. After all, federal debt in the hands of the public is only 74% of debt to GDP. GDP, for lack of a better term, for anybody who doesn't understand it, and economists excuse me for not explaining it well enough, but GDP is really the measure of how much wealth a country generates in a year. Okay? So gross domestic product. How much wealth did we create? That's what GDP is. Unfortunately, the federal debt is not an economic measure of anything, including our national fiscal position. Instead, the federal debt is an annual change, the deficit, a purely linguistic construct that reflects how much the members of Congress choose to label government receipts and payments, or chooses how they label government receipts and payments. He goes on to explain. He says, to see this point, consider the almost $750 billion the government is collecting this year from workers under the heading Social Security payroll taxes and the future Social Security transfer payments these FDIC contributions secure. So he's talking about both what Social Security payments are and what they're receiving in Social Security payments from Americans, and also what is being secured, debt or future payments, by the FDIC. The $750 billion could just as well be called government borrowing, and the future transfer payments could just well as be called principal plus interest on the borrowing. This simple change to the language would more than double this year's reported federal deficit. Indeed, if we're going back in time and we relabel all past Social Security taxes as borrowing, official federal debt held by the public would not be $13 trillion, but $38 trillion, which is 211% of GDP. Now remember, folks, that $38 trillion, that's just Social Security. Remember when I asked you earlier about investing in a company that keeps less than 12 hours of cash on hand? To give you some idea, I'm a small business, a few $1 million a year. We keep no less than 90 days worth of cash on hand. If we don't make 1 penny in the company starting today, this company can survive at least 90 days. And we could probably survive even more because we could start to cut and trim. But without question, 90 days is already paid for it in the can. The government keeps 12 hours on hand. Now let me ask you a question. Would you invest in that company? What if I told you in addition to that, that the company generated, about $1.8 million a year. Well, let's just make the number $18 trillion a year. But they've got $38 trillion just in Social Security debt. Does that give you pause about investing in that company? Should. Let's continue. Let me explain just a little bit about how this works, because the government runs an accounting scheme. There's no other way to say, just like there's no other way to call, no other thing to call Social Security than a Ponzi scheme. It is nothing but a Ponzi scheme. We take from one group of people today and we give it to another group of people. It is a direct transfer. No money is saved. Nothing is put into a lockbox for you. Every penny that comes in gets spent. And right now, what the government does is they don't call that a liability. You see, they have agreed to pay all these Social Security benefits to all of these people out into the future. Do you know how much money the government has on hand to pay that debt? $0. They have no money to pay any Social Security benefit. Every single dollar that comes in Social Security goes to either pay current retirees receiving benefits, or it goes into the general fund and gets spent on other things. The government keeps no lockbox of money for you and your Social Security. Therefore, if you were doing accounting correctly, what you would do is you would be forecasting out and you would say, hey, listen, not only do we have all of this debt that we've already taken on, we've got all this debt that we racked up on our credit card, but we've also agreed to send our 152 children and grandchildren to college. What the government does is it says, we're going to pretend like we don't owe anybody anything in the future. We're going to pretend like we didn't make any future benefit or future guarantees, and we're only going to count the debt that we physically have already taken. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is an accounting gimmick that would get any CEO or chief financial officer of a company thrown in jail. If you tried to do that, the IRS would come to you. The federal government would come to me as a company. If I tried to do that, they would charge me with a crime and they would put me in prison. The only accounting in the world, the only company that gets to run their accounting that way is the U.S. government. It's a sham, a farce. The debt troubles in this country are far, far, far worse than anyone could possibly imagine. Congress's economically arbitrary decision, I'm reading now from the article again. Congress's economically arbitrary decision as to what to put on and what to keep off of the books have not been innocent. Successive Congresses, whether dominated by Republicans or Democrats, have spent the post-war accumulating masses of net physical obligations, virtually all of which have to be kept off the books. You guys want to know what the real debt is? The U.S. fiscal gap, that is both what we have in current debt and what we have agreed to pay in the future, what we owe tomorrow, stands at $210 trillion. Not 18, ladies and gentlemen, 210 trillion. The size of that physical gap is massive. It's 16 times larger than the official U.S. debt, which indicates precisely how useless official debt is for understanding our nation's true fiscal position. U.S. GDP currently stands at $18 trillion. As I said, that's a measure of how much wealth we generate in a year, that $18 trillion. Hence, the fiscal gap represents almost 12 years of GDP. 12 solid years of gross domestic product is what we owe. Our $210 trillion fiscal gap represents represents 58% of the present value of projected future taxes. Let me explain what that means. Hence, eliminating the physical gap via tax hikes requires an immediate and permanent 60% hike in federal taxes. You want to get rid of this debt? Do you know what it's going to take to get rid of just the current obligations that the federal government has made? Just the current promises. It's going to require you pay 60% more in taxes. Whatever you made this year, subtract 60% and tell me if you can live off that number. That's what's required.
Does it say for how many years?
Forever. Forever. It's not that we pay it off in 10 years and we bound. No, forever. Because these debts, these future obligations don't end. They have no expiration date. It goes on forever. Now I want you to think for a moment about Bernie Sanders and all of the wonderful things that he wants to add to the list of future liabilities for this country. Things like free college, free health care, free paid maternity leave, increases in Social Security payments, Medicare and Medicaid payments, brand new carbon taxes. Folks, if today I've illustrated anything to you, it is the fact that nothing is free. Those of you who are in college need to hear this message. Those of you who are Bernie Sanders supporters need to hear this message. There's no money for you. Nothing is free. We're going downhill very, very quickly. It is not a question of if America will crumble. It is simply a matter of when. Let me be very, very clear with you. There is no way out. Understand that. You have two choices right now. If we fixed it right now, it would require an immediate tax increase of 60% of everything that you earn indefinitely. Or it would require an immediate and permanent cut of the total federal deficit and total federal government spending of 40%. Total government spending would instantly, today, have to be reduced by 40%. Not 1% a year, over 5 or 10 years. In order to get out from under this, 40% today and never increase it.
I'm all for that. That's my choice.
It ain't going to happen.
Oh, I know.
It's not going to happen. Now, there is another option. And I have always said that I believe that this was the route the government would take. I believe that the government will default on its debt by inflating it away. The U.S. has done this before. It did it in 1946 when it wiped out a quarter of its debt by lifting price controls, which caused a rise in prices and inflation. It did it again in the 1970s. It will happen again. Only this time it will be on a scale unimaginable to anyone living today. So what are your options? What are you going to do? I just said there's no way out. How do I prepare for it? Do I just give up? Just fall down? What do I do? Unfortunately, I think Milton Friedman said it best. He said, the only remedy for high inflation is high living. What he meant by that is the only thing that you can do in a rapidly inflating economy is to spend your money quickly. That's a really sad state of affairs, isn't it? If you have enough money, you can invest it in some interest hedging assets, some types of bonds as well as real estate. Well-managed businesses is another way that you can invest your money. But more than anything, I think the greatest investment that you can make is in your own human capital. You see, if the only saving grace, if the only remedy for high inflation is high living, that means that your savings is not going to be worth much in the future, and unfortunately I think that's the case. I think those of you who are saving right now, who are in your 30s and 40s, who are saving for retirement, I think you're in for a real shock about where you're going to end up. And if the only remedy is high living, then you have to make sure that whatever happens, your skill set is on the cutting edge. That there's no question that you're going to be able to survive and thrive. You have to be and know and be capable of sustaining yourself. And the easiest way to do that, whether you're going to do it for yourself or whether you're going to do it for another company, is to make sure that you can do what no one else can do. If you want to know how that starts, I've spoke about it many times. I think the number one thing you can do is learn how to sell. There will never be a shortage. If you learn how to sell, you will never be hungry. No matter what happens in this world, you will always be in demand. And if nobody wants you, it's okay. You can do it yourself. I'm going to talk a little bit when we get back from the break about what it means to increase your human capital. And I'm going to tell you a story about someone working in the oil fields and how quickly things can change and how important it is to make sure you're constantly reinvesting in yourself. We'll talk about that when we get back from the break. Stick around.
What you're witnessing is the truth, unfiltered and unashamed.